The judge was about to sentence a street kid for theft, but when he started telling his story, the entire courtroom broke down in tears. The truth about his abandonment left even the prosecutor speechless. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 204 of the Bronx Juvenile Justice Center. Deshaun Matthews stood at the defendant's table, his thin frame nearly drowning in clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks. His fingers gripped the edge of the wooden table, knuckles white with tension. At 13, he barely reached the height of his court-appointed defender's shoulder. Judge Thompson's gavel cracked against the sound block. Case number 2025 JD 1142, State versus Deshaun Matthews. Deshaun's heart hammered against his ribs. The smell of lemon cleaning solution couldn't mask the mustiness of the old courthouse. His public defender, Mr. Roberts, shuffled papers without looking at him. The man's coffee breath made Deshaun's empty stomach turn. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, her heels clicking as she approached the bench. The defendant is charged with multiple counts of petty theft from local businesses. This is his third offense in as many months. Deshaun's mind drifted back to yesterday morning. The hunger had been unbearable. He could still feel the granola bars pressing against his chest under his jacket as he tried to walk casually out of the corner store. The owner's hand had been rough on his shoulder. "The prosecution recommends detention at a juvenile facility," the prosecutor continued. "Mr. Matthews has shown a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that must be addressed." Mr. Roberts cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client is a minor with no previous violent offenses. These are crimes of survival, not malice." Deshaun wanted to laugh. Mr. Roberts had spent all of 5 minutes talking to him before court. The man didn't know anything about survival. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Deshaun. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face. "Young man, do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, sir." Deshaun's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Speak up, please." "Yes, sir," he repeated louder, his voice cracking. The memory of his mother's arrest flashed through his mind. The same courthouse, different judge. The clinking of her handcuffs still echoed in his nightmares. "And what do you have to say for yourself?" Deshaun opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? That he hadn't eaten in 2 days when he stole those granola bars? That the shelter had been full for a week straight? That he'd been sleeping in the McDonald's bathroom because it was too cold outside? The prosecutor stepped forward again. "Your Honor, the defendant's silence speaks volumes. This is clearly a case of Ms. Parker." Judge Thompson held up his hand, silencing her. His eyes hadn't left Deshaun. "I'd like to hear from the young man himself." He gestured to the bailiff. "Please bring up a chair for Mr. Matthews." The metal legs of the chair scraped against the floor. Deshaun sat down slowly, his legs shaking. "Now, Deshaun," Judge Thompson's voice softened slightly. "I want you to tell me your story. Not what your lawyer told you to say. Not what you think I want to hear. Your story. The truth." The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone coughed in the gallery. Deshaun's throat felt like sandpaper. His mother's voice echoed in his head from that last morning. "Baby, whatever happens, you tell the truth. The truth gonna set you free." 3 hours later, the police had knocked down their door. Deshaun started, then stopped. The prosecutor's eyes bored into him. Mr. Roberts shifted uncomfortably beside him. Judge Thompson waited patiently. In the back of the courtroom, a door opened and closed. The sound made Deshaun jump. He could run. He'd gotten good at running. But where would he go? Back to the streets? Back to the hunger? "Take your time, son," Judge Thompson said. "We're listening." Deshaun looked down at his hands. The small scar on his right palm from climbing through a broken window at the abandoned factory where he sometimes slept. The dirt under his fingernails that never seemed to go away no matter how much he scrubbed in public bathrooms. He took a deep breath. The truth. What did he have left to lose? "I steal because I'm hungry," he said finally, his voice stronger than he expected. "And because I got nowhere else to go." The prosecutor started to speak, but Judge Thompson silenced her with a look. "Continue," the judge said. Deshaun's fingers traced the scar on his palm. "My mama, they took her away 8 months ago. Drugs. I was there when they came. We had an apartment then, over on 167th Street. It wasn't much, but..." He swallowed hard. After they took her, I tried staying there. Paid the rent with money she had hidden in her shoebox. But it ran out after 2 months. The fluorescent lights buzzed. His voice echoed slightly in the quiet courtroom. I tried the shelters first, but they're always full. And the ones that got space. He shuddered. Things happen there. Bad things. So I started sleeping wherever I could. McDonald's bathrooms, abandoned buildings. Sometimes the subway if I can sneak in. Judge Thompson nodded slowly. In school? Deshawn's cheeks burned. I tried. For a while. But it's hard to focus when you're hungry all the time. And the other kids, they know when you're wearing the same clothes every day. When you haven't showered, they don't let you forget it. The prosecutor's heels clicked as she shifted her weight. Even Mr. Roberts had stopped shuffling his papers. The first time I stole, it was a pack of crackers, Deshawn continued. I hadn't eaten in 3 days. Thought I was going to pass out. The store owner, he caught me, but he let me go. Gave me the crackers and told me not to come back. His voice cracked. But being hungry, it doesn't go away. And after a while, you get tired of digging through dumpsters behind restaurants, of asking for handouts, of people looking at you like you're nothing. A tear rolled down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly with his sleeve. I know stealing is wrong. My mama taught me better than that. But she also taught me to survive. And sometimes, he looked directly at Judge Thompson for the first time. Sometimes surviving is the only thing you can do. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped their buzzing. Judge Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. Ms. Parker approached the bench. Mr. Roberts, you as well. Deshawn watched as the adults huddled together, speaking in whispers. His future being decided in hushed tones and legal jargon. Just like with his mother. He thought about running again. The doors weren't that far. But something kept him in that chair. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just that he had nowhere left to run to. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, drawing Deshawn's attention back to the bench. The judge's eyes had softened. But there was something else there too. Something Deshawn hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. Tell me about your first night alone, Judge Thompson said, his voice cutting through the silence. After they took your mother. Deshawn's hands trembled in his lap. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. The prosecutor had settled back into her chair, her earlier aggression replaced by something that looked almost like concern. I didn't sleep that night, Deshawn said, his voice barely audible. Just sat by the window, waiting for her to come back. The judge nodded encouragingly. Go on. It was March. Still cold. Deshawn wrapped his arms around himself, as if fighting off that same chill. They let me stay in the apartment that night. The police lady, she said someone from social services would come in the morning. His throat tightened. Nobody came. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the courtroom floor. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. I kept going to school for a while, Deshawn continued. Thought if I just acted normal, everything would be okay. Used the money Mama had saved to buy food, pay rent. But when the money ran out, he remembered standing in the empty apartment, staring at the eviction notice. The landlord hadn't even bothered to knock. First night on the streets, I tried the shelter on 183rd. Deshawn's fingers dug into his arms. It was full. Lady at the desk said to try again tomorrow. But tomorrow was the same. And the next day. And the next. Judge Thompson leaned forward. What about other family members? Deshawn laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the courtroom walls. Mama's people want nothing to do with us. Not since she started using. And my father. He shrugged. Never met him. The social worker, Ms. Martinez, stepped forward from the gallery. Your Honor, if I may? We attempted to locate relatives when Deshawn first entered the system. His maternal grandmother passed away 2 years ago. There are 2 aunts in Georgia, but both declined to take custody. Deshawn remembered those phone calls. The awkward silences. The mumbled excuses. The click of receivers being hung up. So you were alone, Judge Thompson said. Not a question. Yeah. Deshawn shifted in his chair. Found this abandoned factory off Jerome Avenue. Broken window on the 2nd floor. Other kids stayed there too sometimes. We looked out for each other, you know. His mind drifted to Tommy, who'd shown him how to pick the best dumpsters for finding food. Maria, who'd taught him how to wrap newspapers around himself for extra warmth. Both gone now. The streets had a way of making people disappear. But it wasn't safe, he continued. Older guys would come sometimes, looking for trouble. Or worse, had to learn to sleep light, to run fast. The prosecutor's pen scratched against her notepad. Even Mr. Roberts had stopped pretending to read his papers. The hunger's the worst part, Deshawn said, his voice dropping. Not just in your stomach. In your head, too. Makes it hard to think straight, to remember things, like what day it is, or when you last ate something that wasn't from a trash can. He could feel it now, that familiar gnawing emptiness. The granola bars he'd tried to steal yesterday seemed like a lifetime ago. Sometimes I'd try to stay in the McDonald's, he said. Buy small fries with change I found. Make it last for hours. But they know. The workers. They see the same faces every day. Eventually, they tell you to leave. Judge Thompson's gaze hadn't wavered. And that's when you started stealing? Deshawn nodded slowly. Started small. Apples from fruit stands. Bread from outside bakeries. Things I thought nobody would miss. His fingers traced the edge of the chair. But it's never enough. And after a while, he trailed off, remembering the rush of adrenaline, the guilt mixing with relief as he shoved food into his pockets, the fear of getting caught warring with the fear of going hungry another night. You get caught, he finished quietly. 3 times in 3 months, the prosecutor interjected, but her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. Because I got sloppy, Deshawn admitted. Tired, cold, hungry. Makes you take risks you shouldn't. Judge Thompson folded his hands on the bench. What about your mother? Have you had any contact with her? Deshawn's chest tightened. They said she's at Rikers, waiting for trial. I tried to visit once, took the bus all the way there. But they said I needed an adult with me. He blinked hard. Wrote her some letters. Don't know if she got them. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier. Even the usual shuffle of papers and clearing of throats had stopped. Your Honor, Ms. Martinez stepped forward again. We've confirmed that Ms. Matthews is currently serving a 3-year sentence. She's enrolled in a rehabilitation program, but she ain't coming back anytime soon, Deshawn finished for her. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Judge Thompson studied him for a long moment. Deshawn, why are you telling us all this now? You've been in this courtroom twice before. Both times you barely said a word. Deshawn met the judge's eyes. Because I'm tired, sir. Tired of running. Tired of being hungry. Tired of... His voice cracked. Tired of being alone. A murmur ran through the gallery. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mr. Roberts finally looked at his client. Really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. And what do you want? Judge Thompson asked quietly. If you could have anything right now, what would it be? Deshawn's hands clenched in his lap. The question caught him off guard. Want? When was the last time anyone had asked him what he wanted? I want... He hesitated, afraid to voice the hope that had been buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. I want to go back to school, to sleep in a real bed, to not have to dig through garbage to find breakfast. His voice dropped to a whisper. I want someone to care if I don't come home at night. The words hung in the air, raw and honest. Judge Thompson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Ms. Parker, he said, addressing the prosecutor, I believe we need to reassess our approach to this case. Ms. Martinez stepped forward, a thick file folder in her hands. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to present Deshawn's complete case history. Judge Thompson nodded. Proceed. Deshawn's stomach nodded as Ms. Martinez opened the folder. How much did they know? How much had they written down about his life, about his mother, about everything? Deshawn Matthews first came to the attention of Child Protective Services 8 years ago, Ms. Martinez began. There were multiple reports of suspected neglect from his elementary school teachers. The memory flashed through Deshawn's mind. Sitting in his first-grade classroom, stomach growling, trying to concentrate while the other kids ate their packed lunches. His mother, Sandra Matthews, was struggling with addiction at the time, Ms. Martinez continued. However, she managed to maintain custody by agreeing to regular drug testing and counseling. Deshawn remembered those days. His mother, trying so hard to stay clean. The proud smile on her face when she'd show him her sobriety chips. the way she'd pack his lunch, even if it meant she didn't eat. For several years, the situation stabilized, Ms. Martinez said. Ms. Matthews maintained employment as a home health aide. Deshawn's school attendance and grades improved significantly. He was particularly strong in mathematics, she added, pulling out a sheet of paper. His last standardized test scores from 7th grade showed him performing 2 grade levels above average in math. Deshawn shifted in his chair. Numbers had always made sense to him. They were predictable, reliable, unlike everything else in his life. The prosecutor leaned forward. And when did things change? Ms. Martinez's expression darkened. Approximately 14 months ago, Ms. Matthews lost her job due to budget cuts. The stress appears to have triggered a relapse. Deshawn's school attendance became irregular. There were new reports of neglect. She was trying. Deshawn burst out, unable to stay silent. She'd go to meetings, apply for jobs, but nobody wants to hire somebody with a record. Judge Thompson held up a hand. Let Ms. Martinez finish, Deshawn. You'll have your chance to speak. 8 months ago, Ms. Martinez continued. Police responded to an anonymous tip about drug activity in their apartment. They found Ms. Matthews in possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute. Deshawn was present during the arrest. The courtroom seemed to blur. Deshawn could smell the coffee brewing that morning, could hear his mother humming in the kitchen, could feel the splintering of wood as the police broke down their door. After his mother's arrest, Ms. Martinez said, Deshawn should have been placed in emergency foster care. However, she paused, her voice tight with frustration. Due to an administrative oversight, he slipped through the cracks. By the time the error was discovered, he had already left the apartment. The prosecutor's pen scratched against paper. And the attempts to locate family members? We identified 2 maternal aunts in Georgia, Ms. Martinez replied. Both were contacted multiple times. Both declined to take custody, citing financial hardship, and she glanced at Deshawn apologetically, and concerns about his potential behavioral issues. Deshawn's laugh was bitter. They never even met me. How would they know about my behavior? Deshawn, Judge Thompson's voice was gentle but firm. Please. Ms. Martinez pulled out another document. Over the past 8 months, there have been sporadic sightings of Deshawn by various social service agencies. He's occasionally accessed youth drop-in centers for meals or showers. However, he never stayed long enough for meaningful intervention because they always want to put me in a group home, Deshawn interjected. I heard stories about those places. What happens there? This time, Judge Thompson didn't silence him. What kind of stories, Deshawn? Deshawn's fingers dug into his palms, kids getting beat up. Their stuff stolen. Some of the staff. He swallowed hard. They do things. Bad things. And nobody believes the kids when they tell. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Ms. Martinez closed her file slowly. Your Honor, the prosecutor stood, her heels clicking against the floor. While this background is certainly relevant, it doesn't change the fact that Mr. Matthews has committed multiple offenses. The law requires us to act in the best interest of the child, Judge Thompson interrupted. Or have you forgotten that part of your oath, Ms. Parker? The prosecutor's cheeks flushed. Of course not, Your Honor. But there must be consequences for what? Deshawn's voice cracked like a whip. For being hungry? For not wanting to get hurt? For trying to survive? The words echoed off the courtroom walls. Mr. Roberts placed a warning hand on Deshawn's shoulder, but Judge Thompson waved him off. Continue, Deshawn, the judge said. What else do you want to tell us? Deshawn took a shaky breath. You want to punish me? Fine. Lock me up. At least in jail, I'll get 3 meals a day. His voice grew stronger. But don't act like you don't understand why I did what I did. Don't act like any of you would do different if you were me. The prosecutor opened her mouth, then closed it. Even Mr. Roberts seemed at a loss for words. Your Honor, Ms. Martinez spoke into the silence. There may be another option. We recently partnered with a new foster family program. Experienced parents who specifically work with high-risk youth. If the court would consider. Objection. The prosecutor found her voice. Your Honor, given the defendant's history of running away and theft, a more structured environment would be more appropriate. The Juvenile Detention Center has educational programs, counseling, and bars. Deshawn cut in. Don't forget the bars. Judge Thompson raised his hand for silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he studied the people before him. The frustrated prosecutor, the overwhelmed public defender, the earnest social worker, and the skinny boy whose eyes held too much pain for his 13 years. Before I make my decision, the judge said finally, I have one more question for you, Deshawn. He leaned forward. Do you want to change? Deshawn met the judge's gaze. In that moment, he didn't feel like a homeless kid, or a thief, or even a defendant. He felt seen, really seen. Yes, sir, he whispered. More than anything, then prove it, the prosecutor said, rising from her chair. Tell us about your first theft. Not the granola bars from yesterday. Your first real theft. Deshawn's throat went dry. Mr. Roberts shifted beside him, but Judge Thompson's raised hand kept him silent. It was at Tony's Market, Deshawn said finally, on 170th Street. When? About 6 months ago. His voice grew distant. It was raining. One of those cold rains that soaks right through your clothes. The memory was vivid. Water dripping from his hair. His shoes squelching with every step, his stomach cramping from hunger. I've been looking for work, he continued. Tried the car wash on Webster Avenue. The pizza place on Grand Concourse. Nobody wants to hire a kid, especially not one who looks like. He gestured at his worn clothes. So, you decided to steal instead? The prosecutor's voice was sharp. No, Deshawn said quietly. First I tried asking for food, stood outside the market for hours, asked people going in if they could spare anything. His fingers twisted in his lap. Most people just walked past like I wasn't even there. Some told me to get a job. One lady said she'd call the cops if I didn't leave. Judge Thompson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes never left Deshawn's face. It got dark. Started raining harder. Tony, the owner, he was closing up. I watched him through the window, throwing away food that was about to expire. Perfectly good food. Just because the packages were damaged or the fruit was a little bruised. Deshawn's voice hardened. Do you know what that's like? To watch someone throw away food while your stomach's so empty it hurts. The prosecutor's pen stopped scratching. In the gallery, someone cleared their throat. I waited until Tony locked up, went around back to the dumpster. But there was a fence. Deshawn swallowed hard. And dogs. Big ones. Could hear them barking in the yard next door. His hand unconsciously moved to his leg, where the scars still marked his skin. Got caught on the fence trying to climb over. Ripped my leg open pretty bad. But I was so hungry I barely felt it. He looked down at his hands. Found some bread, some fruit that was still good. Ate right there in the alley, in the rain, next to the dumpster. And after that, the prosecutor pressed. It got easier, didn't it? Deshawn's laugh was hollow. Easier? Nah, it never got easier. Just got more necessary. Explain that, Judge Thompson said. Winter was coming. Needed warmer clothes. Real shoes, mine had holes in them. And food. Always needed food. Deshawn's voice shook slightly. Started learning which stores had cameras. Which ones didn't. What times were safest. You're describing calculated criminal behavior, the prosecutor noted. I'm describing survival, Deshawn shot back. You ever tried sleeping on the street in January? Ever had to choose between stealing a blanket or maybe freezing to death? The prosecutor opened her mouth, then closed it. I tried finding real work, Deshawn continued. Swept sidewalks for the bodega on Morris Avenue for a while. $5 a day. But the owner's son caught me sleeping in the storage room one night. That was the end of that. Ms. Martinez stepped forward again. Your Honor, if I may? Our records show that Deshawn did attempt legitimate employment several times. The age restrictions and documentation requirements made it virtually impossible. Because I didn't have ID, Deshawn explained. Everything was in the apartment when we got evicted. Birth certificate, school records, everything. And you didn't think to ask for help? The prosecutor questioned. There are agencies, programs. I tried. Deshawn's voice cracked. Went to one of those agencies. Sat there all day filling out forms they said they'd call me. His fingers clenched into fists. Hard to get calls when you don't have a phone. Hard to get help when you don't have an address. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Tell me about the other kids, Judge Thompson said suddenly. The ones you mentioned from the abandoned factory. Deshawn's shoulders tensed. What about them? Did you steal together? Share what you took. Sometimes, Deshawn admitted. But most of them are gone now. Gone where? Some got picked up by cops. Some went to group homes. Some just disappeared. He stared at his hands. Streets eat people up, you know? Especially kids. The prosecutor paced slowly in front of the bench. And you never thought about turning yourself in? Getting off the streets? Turn myself into who? Deshawn's voice was tired. The cops? The same ones who took my mama away? The social workers who forgot about me? The family that didn't want me? He shook his head. At least on the streets, I knew what to expect. Knew how to handle it. By stealing, the prosecutor stated flatly. By surviving, Deshawn corrected. And yes, sometimes that meant stealing. Sometimes it meant worse things. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Thompson leaned forward. What do you mean by worse things, Deshawn? Deshawn's hands trembled slightly. They're people. They know which kids are alone, which ones are desperate. They offer things. Money, food, a warm place to sleep. His voice dropped to a whisper. But there's always a price. Did you? Judge Thompson started carefully. No, Deshawn said firmly. Saw what happened to kids who did. Saw how it changed them. Made them empty inside. He straightened in his chair. I promised my mama I'd never let anyone break me like that. No matter how hungry I got. The prosecutor had stopped pacing. Even Mr. Roberts was fully engaged now, his earlier indifference gone. Your mother, Judge Thompson said softly. Tell me about her. Before the drugs, Deshawn's throat tightened. She was everything. Worked 2 jobs sometimes. Made sure I had school supplies, even when we could barely pay rent. Used to help me with math homework. A tear rolled down his cheek. She tried so hard, you know. Even after she started using again. She'd still make sure I ate, even if it meant she didn't. The charges she's serving time for, the prosecutor interjected. Did you know she was dealing? Objection. Mr. Roberts finally spoke up. Relevance? I knew, Deshawn said before Judge Thompson could rule. Found the stuff hidden in the bathroom one day. Asked her about it. She cried. Said she was sorry. Said it was just temporary. Just until she could find another job. His voice grew bitter. Guess the cops found it before she could. Deshawn, Judge Thompson's voice cut through the tension. Ms. Martinez mentioned your aptitude for mathematics earlier. Tell me about that. The change of subject caught Deshawn off guard. He shifted in his chair, suddenly self-conscious. It's just numbers, sir. They make sense to me. More than just sense according to your test scores. The judge pressed. 2 grade levels above average, she said. Deshawn shrugged, but his eyes lit up slightly. Numbers don't lie. Don't change. 2 plus 2 is always 4, no matter what's happening around you. When was the last time you attended school? Judge Thompson asked. Regular? Or just showing up sometimes? Both. Deshawn counted on his fingers. Regular was about 10 months ago, but I'd still go sometimes, even after. He gestured vaguely. After everything. Sneaking during lunch period. Some teachers looked the other way. Why math class in particular? A ghost of a smile crossed Deshawn's face. Mr. Peterson. He was different. Didn't ask where I'd been. Didn't make a big deal when I showed up dirty or hungry. Just handed me a worksheet and said, show me what you got, kid. The prosecutor stepped forward. And these irregular visits to school, they had nothing to do with looking for theft opportunities. The smile vanished. No, ma'am. Just wanted to learn, to feel normal for an hour. Tell us about a typical day, Judge Thompson interjected. When you weren't in school, what did you do? Deshawn took a deep breath. Wake up before sunrise, if I slept at all. Had to move early before store owners started showing up. Before people started asking questions about why a kid wasn't in school. His voice took on a mechanical quality, as if reciting a well-worn routine. Check the dumpsters behind bakeries first. They throw out yesterday's stuff early. Then the fruit stands, see if anything fell off the trucks. Sometimes the lady at the coffee shop on Valentine would leave bags of day-old pastries by the back door. Pretty sure she knew kids were taking them. And after food, the judge prompted. Library if I could. They got bathrooms where you can wash up. Security guard usually let me stay if I was quiet. Reading or doing math problems, he paused. Did you know you can find old math textbooks in the library? Work through the whole thing if you want. Ms. Martinez nodded. We found some of those books in the factory where Deshawn stayed. Pages of solved equations. Quite advanced work, actually. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. You were doing math problems while living on the streets? Help me sleep, Deshawn said quietly. When I couldn't stop thinking about everything. Numbers don't judge you. Don't care if you're hungry or dirty or scared. Judge Thompson leaned forward. What kind of math? Algebra mostly. Some geometry. Deshawn's voice grew animated despite himself. Was working on this problem about trains leaving different stations, trying to figure out when they'd meet. Made up my own versions too, with different speeds and distances. For a moment, he sounded like any other excited 13-year-old talking about something he loved. Then reality seemed to crash back in, and his shoulders slumped. Fat lot of good it does me now, though, he muttered. Why do you say that? Judge Thompson asked. Because who cares if I can solve for X when I can't even? His voice cracked. When I can't even keep myself fed? When I can't? He stopped, swallowing hard. Can't what, Deshawn? Can't make my mama proud anymore, he whispered. Can't be the kid she wanted me to be. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Even the prosecutor's pen had stopped its constant scratching. Your mother, Judge Thompson said carefully. What would she think about your math skills? About you teaching yourself, even in these circumstances? Deshawn's eyes filled with tears. She used to say, I got my brains from my grandma. That I was going to be somebody someday. A tear rolled down his cheek. Said maybe I'd be an engineer. Or teach math myself. And now, Deshawn laughed bitterly. Now I'm just another kid in court. Another statistic. Another young man, Judge Thompson interrupted, who managed to maintain his love of learning despite impossible circumstances. Who taught himself advanced mathematics while fighting for survival. Who hasn't let his environment destroy his potential. Deshawn looked up, startled by the force in the judge's voice. Your Honor, the prosecutor started. While this is all very touching, it doesn't change. It changes everything, Ms. Parker. Judge Thompson cut her off. It shows us exactly what kind of person we're dealing with. He turned back to Deshawn. Tell me something. If you had the chance to go back to school, regular school, what would you want to learn? Deshawn's answer came without hesitation. Everything, but especially more math. And maybe, he hesitated, maybe computer programming? Mr. Peterson said it's all math, really. Just telling computers how to solve problems. And if you had a stable place to live, people supporting you, I'd study all the time, Deshawn said earnestly. Wouldn't waste it. Wouldn't run. His voice cracked again. I just want a chance. A real one. Ms. Martinez stepped forward. Your Honor, the foster family I mentioned. They have experience with gifted children. The father is actually a retired math teacher. Deshawn's head snapped up. What? The Wilsons, Ms. Martinez continued. They've worked with several children from similar backgrounds. Their last foster son is now attending college on a full scholarship. The prosecutor frowned. Your Honor, given the defendant's history of running. I wouldn't run, Deshawn interrupted. His voice was stronger than it had been all day. Not if they really wanted to help. Not if I could learn. Could maybe... He trailed off, hope and fear warring in his expression. Could maybe what? Judge Thompson prompted. Could maybe still make my mama proud, Deshawn whispered. Even with everything that's happened. Could maybe still be somebody... Judge Thompson studied him for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, the city continued its endless noise. Sirens, traffic, the pulse of life in the Bronx. But in courtroom 204, all attention was focused on the skinny 13-year-old whose dreams had somehow survived the streets. Ms. Martinez, the judge said finally, tell me more about this family. The Wilsons live in Riverdale, Ms. Martinez began, but the prosecutor cut her off. Your Honor, before we proceed down this path, I need to address the severity of the defendant's actions. She stood, heels clicking against the floor. While his circumstances are certainly unfortunate, we're still dealing with multiple counts of theft. Deshawn's hands clenched in his lap. The brief spark of hope began to fade. Ms. Parker, Judge Thompson's voice had an edge to it. Proceed carefully. The prosecutor squared her shoulders. Deshawn, she turned to face him directly. You've spoken a lot about survival today. about having no choice. But isn't it true that you became more selective in what you stole over time? Started taking more than just food? Deshawn's throat tightened. What do you mean? The incident at Marshall's department store last month. She picked up a paper from her desk. You were caught attempting to steal a backpack. And inside it were not just food items, but a portable radio, batteries, and a scientific calculator. Hardly survival necessities. The courtroom fell silent. Even Ms. Martinez looked surprised. Deshawn? Judge Thompson prompted. Would you like to explain? Deshawn's voice was barely audible. The radio was for music. To help me sleep. To not feel so. He swallowed hard. So alone at night. And the calculator? The prosecutor pressed. For math, he whispered. The library. They started recognizing me. Wouldn't let me stay as long. Thought maybe if I had a calculator, I could still... His voice trailed off. The prosecutor stepped closer. So you admit to stealing non-essential items? To becoming more sophisticated in your theft? Ms. Parker, Judge Thompson warned. No, it's okay. Deshawn straightened in his chair. You want the truth? Yeah, I stole more than just food. Stole things to make life a little less. His voice cracked. Less empty. Less scary. Less cold. He looked directly at the prosecutor. You think I'm sophisticated? I'm just tired. Tired of being hungry. Tired of being scared. Tired of feeling like I don't exist unless I'm getting caught stealing something. The prosecutor's expression flickered. And what guarantee do we have that this pattern won't continue? That with more resources, you won't simply become more ambitious in your crimes. Deshawn's laugh was hollow. You think I like stealing? Like feeling ashamed every time I walk into a store? Like watching people hold their bags closer when I pass by? Tears welled in his eyes, but his voice grew stronger. You want to know what I want? I want to wake up in the same bed every morning. Want to go to school without being embarrassed about my clothes. Want to raise my hand in math class without worrying about my stomach growling. He stood up suddenly, causing Mr. Roberts to reach for his arm. But Deshawn shrugged him off. You want guarantees? I can't give you any. But I can tell you this. Every single time I stole something, every single time I had to run or hide or lie, I felt like I was letting my mama down. Like I was becoming everything she tried to protect me from. His voice echoed off the courtroom walls. You think I'm just some street kid? Some statistic? I'm the son of Sandra Matthews. She worked 2 jobs to keep me in school. Helped me with homework even when she was bone tired. Taught me right from wrong even when she was struggling to stay clean. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks now. And yeah, she messed up. Yeah, she's in jail. But she never stopped believing I could be somebody. Never stopped telling me I was smart, that I was worth something. The prosecutor had stepped back, her earlier aggression replaced by uncertainty. So, you want to know if I'll keep stealing if someone gives me a chance? Deshawn continued. No, because for the first time since they took my mama away, someone's offering me something better than just survival. They're offering me a future. He turned to Judge Thompson. Sir, I know I did wrong. Know I need to face consequences. But please. His voice cracked. Please don't let this be the end of my story. Don't let the streets win. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the constant hum of the fluorescent lights seemed muted. Judge Thompson leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, you were telling us about the Wilsons? Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Martinez stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. James Wilson taught mathematics at Bronx Science for 30 years. His wife, Angela, is a counselor specializing in trauma and addiction recovery. They've fostered 8 children over the past decade, all with challenging backgrounds. She pulled out a photograph. Their home has a dedicated study space for each child. They provide tutoring, counseling, and, she glanced at Deshawn, and a family environment focused on healing and growth. And they're willing to take Deshawn? Judge Thompson asked. More than willing, Ms. Martinez replied. When I described his mathematical aptitude, Mr. Wilson specifically asked to meet him. Deshawn's hands trembled. They know about everything? About the stealing and... They know, Ms. Martinez nodded. They also know about your self-study in the library, about the math problems you worked on even while homeless. Mr. Wilson said, and I quote, that's not just intelligence, that's determination. Fresh tears spilled down Deshawn's cheeks. Judge Thompson turned to the prosecutor. Ms. Parker? Your final thoughts? The prosecutor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. The state's recommendation. She paused, looking at Deshawn. The state's recommendation is amended. We suggest a probationary period with mandatory counseling and school attendance, under the supervision of the proposed foster family. Judge Thompson nodded slowly. Deshawn, any final words before I make my decision? Deshawn wiped his eyes with his sleeve. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. Just one thing, sir. If you give me this chance, I promise I won't waste it. Not just for me, but for my mama, for Mr. Peterson who believed in me, for these people willing to take a chance on me. He straightened his shoulders. I can't change where I came from, but maybe I can change where I'm going. Judge Thompson picked up his gavel, its weight suddenly seeming very significant. The future of the boy before him hung in the balance. A boy who had survived the streets not just with his body, but with his dreams intact. The sound of the gavel hitting the sound block echoed through courtroom 204. Judge Thompson set it down carefully, his eyes fixed on Deshawn. Before I render my decision, he began, I want to make something very clear. He leaned forward. What happens today will depend entirely on you, Deshawn. The choice I'm about to make is not the end of your story. It's barely the beginning. Deshawn nodded, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear. Ms. Martinez, the judge continued, are the Wilsons here today? Yes, Your Honor. She turned toward the gallery. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson? A tall man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood up, along with a woman whose kind face reminded Deshawn painfully of his grandmother. They moved to the front of the courtroom. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, Judge Thompson addressed them. You've been briefed on Deshawn's situation? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Wilson's voice was deep and steady. We've reviewed his file thoroughly, and you understand the challenges? The potential risks? Mrs. Wilson stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may? At the judge's nod, she continued. Every child we've fostered has come to us with challenges, with pain, with trust issues. Deshawn's story is unique to him, but the need for stability, for understanding, for a chance to grow, that's universal. Deshawn stared at them, barely breathing. They looked normal, like teachers or librarians, not like people who'd want a street kid in their home. Deshawn, Mrs. Wilson turned to him, her eyes warm. We have a room ready for you. A desk by the window. James, Mr. Wilson, he's already talking about math competitions. Math competitions? Deshawn's voice cracked. Mr. Wilson smiled. Ms. Martinez showed us some of your work from the library. Your understanding of algebraic concepts is remarkable, especially given the circumstances. With proper guidance, he adjusted his glasses. Well, let's just say I see a lot of potential. The prosecutor cleared her throat. Your Honor, while this all sounds promising, we need to address the matter of restitution for the thefts. Agreed. Judge Thompson nodded. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, this would need to be part of Deshawn's rehabilitation plan. We've discussed that, Mr. Wilson said. We believe community service, combined with a part-time job when he's ready, would be appropriate. Help him understand the value of honest work while making amends. Deshawn's hands twisted in his lap. A job? Not right away, Mrs. Wilson assured him. First priority is getting you settled. Back in school. Regular meals. Regular sleep. She smiled softly. Regular everything. But Deshawn looked down at his worn clothes, his dirty sneakers. I don't have anything. No clothes, no school stuff, no. We can help with all that. Mrs. Wilson's voice was gentle. One step at a time. Judge Thompson watched this exchange carefully. Deshawn, what are you thinking right now? Thinking it doesn't feel real, he whispered. Thinking any minute I'm going to wake up back in that factory or under that bridge by the park, or it's real. Judge Thompson's voice was firm. But it comes with conditions. Strict ones. Deshawn straightened in his chair. Yes, sir. First, the judge held up one finger, mandatory school attendance. No exceptions except for illness verified by a doctor. Deshawn nodded eagerly. Second, weekly counseling sessions. You've been through trauma, Deshawn, that needs to be addressed. Another nod, slower this time. Third, complete honesty with the Wilsons. If you're struggling, you tell them. If you're tempted to run, you tell them. If you're having thoughts about stealing again, you tell them. No secrets. Deshawn swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Fourth, you'll meet with Ms. Martinez twice a month for progress checks. Any violation of these conditions could result in your placement in juvenile detention. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I understand. Judge Thompson looked at the Wilsons. And you're prepared for this commitment? It won't be easy. Mrs. Wilson's voice was steady. Nothing worth doing ever is, Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly, then picked up his gavel again. Very well. In the case of the state versus Deshawn Matthews, this court rules as follows. The courtroom held its breath. The defendant is hereby placed on probation for a period of 18 months, during which time he will reside with James and Angela Wilson as his foster parents. He will attend school regularly, participate in counseling, and complete 100 hours of community service. The gavel struck. Additionally, the defendant will write letters of apology to all businesses from which he stole, and when employed, will make financial restitution as determined by the probation office. Another strike. This court will review his progress in 3 months. Any violation of the stated conditions will result in immediate placement in juvenile detention. Final strike. Ms. Martinez will oversee the transition and provide regular reports. Court costs are waived. He looked directly at Deshawn. Do you understand everything I've said? Deshawn stood on shaky legs. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. I won't let you down. Don't let yourself down, Judge Thompson corrected gently. This is your chance, Deshawn. Your fresh start. Ms. Martinez stepped forward with some papers. We'll need to process some forms before. Could I? Deshawn interrupted, then caught himself. Sorry, but could I maybe call my mama? Tell her what happened. The room went quiet. Judge Thompson looked at Ms. Martinez, who nodded. I'll arrange it, she said softly. We can do it from my office before you leave with the Wilsons. Mrs. Wilson moved closer to Deshawn, not touching him, but standing near enough to offer support. Would you like us to come with you? Or would you prefer to talk to her privately? Deshawn looked up at her, surprised by the question, by the fact that she was asking what he wanted instead of telling him what to do. Maybe just Ms. Martinez? For now. He glanced apologetically at the Wilsons. It's not that I don't. Of course, Mrs. Wilson's smile was understanding. Take whatever time you need. We'll be right here. As the court officials began gathering their papers and the gallery started to clear, Deshawn remained standing at the defendant's table, his whole body trembling slightly. You okay? Mr. Wilson asked quietly. Deshawn looked around the courtroom, at Judge Thompson reviewing documents, at the prosecutor organizing her files, at Ms. Martinez waiting patiently by the door, at the Wilsons watching him with kind eyes. No, he answered honestly, remembering his promise about truth. I'm scared, but... He took a deep breath. But for the first time in a long time, I'm scared of messing up something good instead of scared of just surviving. Mr. Wilson nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's a better kind of scared to be. The phone call to Rikers Island was brief, but intense. Deshawn gripped the receiver in Ms. Martinez's office, his knuckles white as his mother's voice crackled through the line. Baby? That really you? Yeah, Mama. It's me. His voice cracked. I got something to tell you. He told her everything. The court, Judge Thompson, the Wilsons. His mother was quiet for a long moment after he finished. They sound like good people, baby, she said finally, her voice thick with tears. Better than what I could give you. Mama, don't. No, listen to me. Her voice grew firm. You got a chance here. A real one. Don't let my mistakes hold you back. You hear me? You take this chance, and you run with it. Yes, ma'am. Tears rolled down his cheeks. I love you, Mama. Love you too, baby. So much. She paused. Now go on. Go start your new life. The ride to the Wilsons' house was surreal. Deshawn sat in the back seat of their car, a clean, well-maintained Honda, watching the streets of the Bronx give way to the tree-lined avenues of Riverdale. His few possessions fit in a small paper bag provided by Ms. Martinez. You hungry? Mrs. Wilson asked, glancing back at him. Deshawn started to say no automatically, then remembered his promise about honesty. Yes, ma'am. Good thing I put a lasagna in the oven before we left for court, she smiled. Should be ready by the time we get home. Home. The word felt strange in his mind. The Wilsons' house was modest by Riverdale standards, but enormous to Deshawn's eyes. 2 stories, red brick, with actual flowers growing in the front yard. His legs felt like lead as he followed them up the front walk. "Let's show you your room first," Mr. Wilson suggested, carrying Deshawn's paper bag. "Then you can wash up before dinner if you'd like." The room was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway lined with framed mathematical formulas and artistic representations of geometric shapes. Deshawn recognized some of the equations from his library studies. "Here we are." Mrs. Wilson opened the door. Deshawn froze in the doorway. The room wasn't large, but to him it was a palace. A real bed with clean sheets and what looked like 3 pillows. A wooden desk under a window overlooking the backyard. A dresser. A bookshelf already stocked with math textbooks. "The bathroom's right across the hall," Mr. Wilson said. "Fresh towels are in the cabinet. And we put some new clothes in the dresser. Just basics for now. We can go shopping for more once you're settled." Deshawn stepped into the room slowly, afraid to touch anything. His shoes left dirty marks on the clean carpet. "I should." He looked down at his feet. "I'm making a mess." "Nothing a vacuum can't fix," Mrs. Wilson said gently. "Why don't you take a shower? I'll put some new clothes on the bathroom counter for you. Then come down for dinner when you're ready." They left him alone in the room. His room? Deshawn stood there for several minutes, just breathing. Then he went to the bathroom. The hot water felt like a miracle. He stood under the spray until his skin turned pink, using the new soap that smelled like clean things, like normal things. The clothes Mrs. Wilson had left were simple: sweatpants, a t-shirt, new socks, new underwear still in the package. When he came downstairs, the smell of food made his stomach growl audibly. Perfect timing. Mrs. Wilson was setting the table, a real table, with matching plates and everything. "James, could you get the garlic bread?" They waited for him to sit before serving the food. Deshawn stared at his plate. Lasagna, garlic bread, salad. More food than he'd seen in months. "Go ahead," Mr. Wilson encouraged. "Angela's lasagna is famous in the neighborhood." Deshawn picked up his fork with trembling fingers. The first bite brought tears to his eyes. "You okay?" Mrs. Wilson asked softly. He nodded, not trusting his voice. They let him eat in silence, not pushing conversation. When he finally looked up from his empty plate, Mr. Wilson smiled. "There's plenty more if you want seconds." Deshawn shook his head. "Thank you, but I don't want to get sick. Been a while since I ate." "Of course," Mrs. Wilson understood. "We'll save the rest for tomorrow." After dinner, they showed him around the house. The kitchen where he could get snacks anytime he was hungry. The living room with its comfortable couches and TV. The study lined with books. The backyard with a basketball hoop. "Oh," Mr. Wilson said, as if just remembering something. "There's one more thing in your room I forgot to show you." Back upstairs, he opened the desk drawer and pulled out a calculator. Not just any calculator, a sophisticated graphing calculator, the kind Deshawn had tried to steal. "Every mathematician needs proper tools," Mr. Wilson said simply. Deshawn's hands shook as he took it. I can't." "You can." Mr. Wilson's voice was firm. "It's not a reward, Deshawn. It's a tool. Like a carpenter needs a hammer or a chef needs knives. You'll need this for school." "Speaking of school," Mrs. Wilson added, "we have an appointment with Riverdale Middle School tomorrow morning, just to discuss placement and get you registered. No pressure. You won't start classes until next week." Deshawn clutched the calculator. What if I'm too far behind?" "Then we'll catch you up," Mr. Wilson said simply. "That's what I do. I teach math. And from what I've seen of your work, you're not as far behind as you think." Later that night, after they'd shown him how to use the alarm clock and reminded him where the bathroom was, after they'd said goodnight and left him alone in his new room, Deshawn sat on the edge of the bed, his bed. The sheets were cool and crisp. The pillow was soft. The night was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. No sirens. No shouting. No rats scurrying in the walls. He got up and went to the window. The backyard was dark except for a motion sensor light. The basketball hoop was a shadowy silhouette. Beyond the yard, he could see other houses, other windows lit from within. His reflection in the glass startled him. Clean clothes. Clean face. Clean hair. He looked younger somehow. More like a kid and less like a survivor. The calculator sat on his desk where he'd placed it carefully. Next to it, a notebook and pencils. Simple things. Normal things. Things he dreamed about during long nights in the factory or under bridges. Deshawn touched the window glass. He could probably open it. Could probably climb down the drain pipe he'd noticed earlier. The streets weren't that far away. The familiar darkness waited just beyond the yard. But for the first time in 8 months, he didn't want to run. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel safer than staying. He turned away from the window and went back to the bed, his bed. The sheets rustled as he slid under them. The pillow cradled his head. His body seemed to melt into the mattress. Just before sleep took him, he remembered his mother's words. Take this chance and run with it. For the first time in 8 months, Deshawn Matthews fell asleep without fear. 1 month passed like a dream. Deshawn sat at his desk in Mr. Peterson's math class, working through a set of equations. His new textbook lay open beside him, its pages crisp and clean. No torn corners. No water stains. No smudges from dirty fingers. 5 minutes left, Mr. Peterson announced to the class. Deshawn glanced at his work. He'd already finished the assigned problems and had moved on to the extra credit questions. His handwriting was neater now. Mrs. Wilson had helped him practice. The bell rang. As other students packed up their bags, Mr. Peterson approached Deshawn's desk. "How are you settling in?" he asked quietly. Deshawn looked up at the teacher who'd never turned him away, even during his worst days. "Good, sir. The Wilsons, they're really helping me? I can tell." Mr. Peterson picked up Deshawn's homework paper. "Your work is exceptional. Mr. Wilson mentioned you might be interested in the math team." Deshawn nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. He's been helping me prepare for the tryouts next week." "Good." Mr. Peterson smiled. "We could use someone with your talent." As Deshawn packed his bag, a real backpack, not stolen but bought with the Wilsons at the store, he thought about how much had changed in just 4 weeks. The first few days had been the hardest. Waking up in a real bed, having regular meals, following a normal schedule, it had felt like playing pretend. He jumped at every sound, flinched when anyone moved too quickly, hoarded food in his desk drawers until Mrs. Wilson gently explained that he didn't need to anymore. The other kids at school had been curious about the new student, but not unkind. His past wasn't public knowledge. To them, he was just another kid from another part of the Bronx, living with the Wilsons like others had before him. The counseling sessions were tough. Twice a week, he sat with Dr. Roberts, no relation to his court-appointed lawyer, and talked about things he'd tried to forget. About his mother, about the streets, about the fear and hunger and loneliness. "Deshawn?" He looked up. Mr. Peterson was holding out a flyer. "Math competition next month at Bronx Science. You should consider it." Deshawn took the paper, his heart racing. A real competition, like normal kids did. After school, he found Mr. Wilson waiting in the usual spot. They'd fallen into a routine. Mr. Wilson would pick him up, they'd stop at the library if Deshawn needed books, then head home for study time before dinner. "Good day?" Mr. Wilson asked as Deshawn got into the car. "Yes, sir." He pulled out the competition flyer. "Mr. Peterson gave me this." Mr. Wilson's eyes lit up as he read it. "Excellent. We should start preparing this weekend. But first," he smiled, "we have your 3-month court review tomorrow." Deshawn's stomach tightened. Do you think it'll be okay?" "More than okay." Mr. Wilson pulled into traffic. "Your grades are outstanding. No missed days of school. Counseling reports are positive. Ms. Martinez's last visit went well. You've completed 30 hours of community service at the food bank. Everything points to success." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Deshawn watched the familiar streets pass by. Streets he'd once haunted, now just part of his route home. Home. The word didn't feel strange anymore. That evening, after dinner and homework, Deshawn sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Wilson, writing his weekly letter to his mother. "Dear Mama," he read aloud, something Mrs. Wilson had encouraged to help him express his feelings. "Got an A on my math test today. Mr. Peterson says I might make the math team. Mr. Wilson's been helping me practice." He paused, looking at Mrs. Wilson. "Should I tell her about court tomorrow?" "Of course," she smiled. "She'll want to know." He continued writing. "Got court review tomorrow. Mr. Wilson says it'll go good. I haven't missed any school or nothing. Been doing my community service at the food bank. Sometimes I see kids there like I used to be. Makes me want to help more. Mrs. Wilson squeezed his shoulder gently. Miss you, Mama. The Wilsons are real good to me, but I still miss you. Mrs. Wilson says that's okay. Missing someone and moving forward ain't opposite things. The next morning, courtroom 204 looked different somehow. Smaller, maybe less intimidating. Deshawn sat between the Wilsons, wearing clean clothes and carrying his latest report card. Judge Thompson studied the papers before him. Ms. Martinez, your report? Deshawn has exceeded all expectations, Your Honor, Ms. Martinez said proudly. Perfect attendance at school. Stellar academic performance, particularly in mathematics. Regular participation in counseling. Consistent compliance with all probation requirements. The prosecutor, a different one this time, nodded in agreement. The state has no concerns, Your Honor. Mr. Matthews appears to be making excellent progress. Judge Thompson turned to Deshawn. Stand up, son. Deshawn rose, his legs steady this time. 3 months ago, you stood in this courtroom and made me a promise, the judge said. Do you remember what it was? Yes, sir. Deshawn's voice was clear. I promised not to waste my chance. And have you? No, sir. He squared his shoulders. Been trying my best every day. Judge Thompson smiled. I can see that. Your progress reports are impressive. But more importantly, you look different. Healthier. More confident. He leaned forward. Are you happy, Deshawn? The question caught him off guard. Happy? When was the last time anyone had asked him that? Yes, sir, he answered honestly. Still got hard days. Still miss my mama. Still got a lot to work through in counseling. But, he glanced at the Wilsons. But I feel safe now. Feel like maybe I can be somebody after all. The judge nodded. The purpose of this review was to determine if any modifications to your probation terms were necessary. Based on all reports, I see no need for changes. Continue on your current path, Deshawn. You're doing well. After court, Mr. Wilson took them all out for ice cream. Deshawn, Mrs. Wilson, and Ms. Martinez. They sat in the parlor, celebrating quietly. Oh, Ms. Martinez remembered something. I have news about your mother, Deshawn. She's completed her first rehabilitation program. Early release might be possible in 18 months with good behavior. Deshawn's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Really? Really? She's doing well. Says your letters give her strength. That night, Deshawn sat at his desk, working on extra math problems Mr. Wilson had given him. The competition flyer was pinned to his bulletin board. His calculator, his own calculator, sat ready beside his notebook. Through the window, he could see the basketball hoop where he sometimes played with other kids from the neighborhood. The motion sensor light kicked on as a cat crossed the yard. In the distance, the city hummed. He thought about the boy he'd been 3 months ago. The hunger, the fear, the loneliness. The weight of survival crushing every other dream. That boy felt like a stranger now. Opening his desk drawer, Deshawn pulled out a small notebook. His goals list, something Dr. Roberts had suggested he keep. He read through his entries. Make the math team, win a competition, graduate middle school with honors, get into a good high school, maybe college someday. Make mama proud, make myself proud. He added a new one. Help other kids like me. A knock at his door. Mrs. Wilson peeked in. Don't stay up too late? Okay. School tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. He smiled. Just finishing up? She started to leave, then paused. We're proud of you, Deshawn. James and I. Very proud. After she left, Deshawn looked back at his notebook. At his goals. At his dreams that didn't feel impossible anymore. I came from the streets, he whispered to himself. But that's not where I'm going. He turned back to his math problems, pencil moving confidently across the page, writing his own new story, one equation at a time.